The morning sun of June 4, 1942, cast long shadows across the Pacific as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's massive fleet approached what he believed would be Japan's greatest naval victory, for aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru cut through the azure waters like steel predators, their decks bristling with the most advanced naval aircraft in the world. Behind them followed battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in a formation so vast it seemed to stretch beyond the horizon itself. Yamamoto stood on the bridge of his flagship Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, watching the first wave of Kate bombers and Zero fighters disappear into the morning haze toward Midway atoll. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: crush the tiny American outpost, draw out the remnants of the Pacific Fleet, and deliver the decisive blow that would force the United States to sue for peace. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviation had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami, sinking Allied warships from the Philippines to the Indian Ocean. What the Japanese admiral could not know was that his every move had been anticipated. Far below the waves, American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval cipher, revealing Yamamoto's intentions with stunning clarity. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, had deployed his forces with surgical precision. The carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the latter hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea, lay in wait northeast of Midway, their positions unknown to the approaching Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his flight goggles as he prepared his Douglas Dauntless dive bombers aboard the Enterprise. The morning briefing had been sobering. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Yet there was something in the air, a tension that spoke of opportunity. The Japanese had grown overconfident, their intelligence flawed, their guard perhaps lowered by months of uninterrupted victory. According to historical accounts documented in Walter Lord's incredible victory, the stage was set for what would become the most decisive naval battle in the Pacific War. The Japanese First Air Fleet, which had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating effect, was about to face its greatest test. But as the sun climbed higher over the vast expanse of the Pacific, neither side could have imagined the carnage that would unfold in the next few hours. On Midway itself, Marines and sailors braced for the incoming assault. The tiny coral atoll, barely 6 miles across, held strategic importance far beyond its size. From here, American aircraft could threaten Japanese supply lines and launch attacks on the Japanese home islands. The defenders knew they were vastly outnumbered, but they also knew that every minute they held out gave the Pacific Fleet precious time to position itself for the counterstrike. As the first Japanese bombs began falling on Midway's airfield, sending up towering columns of smoke and coral dust, the greatest naval battle of the Pacific War was about to begin. The fate of the Pacific, and perhaps the entire course of World War II, hung in the balance as two mighty fleets prepared to clash in the blue waters between Hawaii and Japan. The thunderous roar of aircraft engines echoed across the Pacific as the first wave of Japanese bombers approached Midway atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led his formation of Kate bombers and Zero fighters in a devastating assault on the American installations below. Explosions rippled across the tiny island as hangars, fuel depots, and the critical airfield came under withering attack. Black smoke billowed into the clear morning sky, visible for miles across the ocean, but the defenders of Midway were far from helpless as the Japanese aircraft swept in for their attack runs. American fighters rose to meet them. Marine Corps pilots in their outdated Brewster Buffaloes and Navy pilots in Grumman Wildcats threw themselves against the superior Japanese Zeros with desperate courage. The sky above Midway became a swirling maelstrom of tracer fire, diving aircraft, and smoke trails as the air battle intensified. Captain Richard Fleming, commanding a squadron of Marine dive bombers, led his men in a counterattack against the Japanese fleet. The antiquated Vindicator dive bombers, already obsolete by Pacific War standards, pressed their attack against overwhelming odds. Fleming's aircraft, along with Army Air Force B-26s and Navy torpedo bombers, struck out across the ocean toward the Japanese carriers, most would not return. Aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced a crucial decision. Tomonaga's radio message crackled through the ship's communication system. There is need for a second attack. The first strike had damaged Midway's facilities, but the airfield remained operational. American aircraft continued to take off and land, posing a continued threat to the Japanese operation. Nagumo ordered his second wave of aircraft, originally armed with armor-piercing bombs for use against American ships, to be rearmed with high explosive and incendiary bombs for a second strike against Midway. On the hangar decks of all four carriers, Japanese ground crews worked frantically to switch the ordnance. Bombs were wheeled back to storage magazines while different weapons were brought forward. The process would take precious time, leaving the carriers vulnerable. As documented in Gordon Prange's comprehensive study Miracle at Midway, the decision to rearm the second wave would prove catastrophic for the Japanese fleet. At 9:18 in the morning, a Japanese reconnaissance plane finally spotted the American task force. The pilot's radio message sent shockwaves through the Japanese command. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships in position bearing 10 degrees, distanced 140 miles from Midway. The discovery of the American fleet caught Nagumo completely off guard. His aircraft were in the worst possible position, some returning from the Midway strike low on fuel and ammunition, others on the hangar decks being rearmed, and none ready for immediate launch against enemy ships. The admiral now faced an agonizing choice: launch an immediate but poorly coordinated strike with whatever aircraft were available, or wait for his returning planes to land and properly organize his attack. Meanwhile, American torpedo bombers from all three carriers were already racing toward the Japanese fleet. The slow, vulnerable Douglas Devastators flew barely above the wavetops, their crews knowing they were flying into almost certain death. The Japanese combat air patrol of Zero fighters fell upon them like hawks, shooting down plane after plane. In the clear morning sky, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, pressed his attack despite impossible odds. His 15 Devastators flew straight into the teeth of the Japanese defenses, their crews displaying the kind of courage that would become legendary. One by one, the American torpedo bombers were shot down, their crews disappearing beneath the blue waters of the Pacific. The Japanese defenders watched in amazement as wave after wave of American aircraft threw themselves against the fleet with suicidal determination. Zero fighters dove and climbed, their guns blazing, while the massive Japanese carriers maneuvered desperately to avoid the incoming torpedoes. The scene was one of controlled chaos as the two fleets finally came to grips in the greatest carrier battle ever fought. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol had decimated the American torpedo bomber attacks, shooting down nearly every plane that approached the fleet. Zero fighters swooped and dove through the morning sky like deadly birds of prey, their guns chattering as they eliminated threat after threat. Admiral Nagumo watched from Akagi's bridge as the ocean around his fleet became dotted with the wreckage of American aircraft and the smoke of their final moments. Yet the sacrifice of the torpedo bombers had not been in vain. The Japanese fighters, drawn down to sea level by the low-flying Devastators, had left the high-altitude approaches to the fleet virtually undefended. The sky above the Japanese carriers lay empty and vulnerable, awaiting the arrival of the American dive bombers that would determine the course of the battle. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour. His fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels, and some of his pilots were already reporting that they had reached the point where they might not make it back to their carrier. The vast Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no sign of the enemy fleet that intelligence had promised would be there. Then, at 10:22 in the morning, McCluskey spotted the white wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward. The ship was the Arashi, which had been depth-charging the American submarine Nautilus and was now hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey made the fateful decision to follow the destroyer's wake, leading his dive bombers directly toward their target. What McCluskey saw as he crested the clouds at 14,000 feet was beyond his wildest expectations. Spread out below him lay the entire Japanese striking force for massive aircraft carriers. Arranged in a box formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. The carriers were caught in their most vulnerable moment, their hangars filled with armed and fueled aircraft, their decks cluttered with planes waiting to take off. The scene that followed would become one of the most decisive moments in naval history. McCluskey's dive bombers, joined by aircraft from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, plunged down through the clear morning air toward the Japanese fleet. The angle of their dive was so steep that the ocean seemed to rush up to meet them as they targeted the flight decks of the enemy carriers. According to the detailed account in Samuel Eliot Morrison's The Two-Ocean War, the American dive bombers struck with devastating precision. The first bombs crashed through Akagi's flight deck, penetrating into the hangar spaces where armed aircraft waited for launch. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship as aviation fuel ignited and ammunition detonated. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a raging inferno. Kaga suffered an even more catastrophic fate. Multiple bomb hits tore through her flight deck, igniting massive fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. The carrier's own aircraft, loaded with fuel and ordnance, became secondary weapons as they exploded in chain reactions that shook the massive vessel. From stem to stern, Soryu, the third carrier, was hit by 3 bombs in rapid succession, her flight deck collapsing into the hangar spaces below. The timing of the attack was perfect and perfectly devastating. The Japanese carriers were caught with their aircraft being rearmed and refueled, their decks crowded with planes, their hangars filled with aviation gasoline and explosive ordnance. The American bombs, falling from 14,000 feet, struck with the force of artillery shells, but it was the secondary explosions that truly destroyed the Japanese fleet. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 aircraft carriers were transformed from instruments of war into floating funeral pyres. The morning sun, which had risen on Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific, now shone down on pillars of black smoke rising from the burning hulks of what had been the most powerful naval striking force in the world. Admiral Nagumo, watching from Akagi's bridge as his flagship burned around him, could barely comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. In less than half an hour, Japan had lost more aircraft carriers than they had lost in the entire war to date. The course of the Pacific War had been altered forever in those crucial minutes. Above the blue waters between Hawaii and Japan, the surviving Japanese carrier Hiru, under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, had been operating slightly separated from the main force when the American dive bombers struck. As black smoke billowed from her 3 sister ships, Hiru became the sole remaining offensive weapon. In what had been the mightiest naval striking force ever assembled, Yamaguchi, known throughout the Imperial Navy for his aggressive tactics and fighting spirit, was determined to extract vengeance for the devastating American attack. Every serviceable aircraft aboard Hiru was hastily prepared for launch. Kate bombers, their wings folded for deck storage, were wheeled into position while Zero fighters warmed their engines on the flight deck. The carrier's remaining air group, though depleted by the morning's operations, still possessed enough striking power to inflict serious damage on the American fleet. At 10:58 in the morning, the first wave of 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters roared off Hiryu's deck, their destination the American carrier Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the first strike against Midway, now found himself commanding what might be the Japanese Navy's final offensive action of the battle. His left fuel tank had been holed by American anti-aircraft fire during the morning attack, but he chose to lead his men anyway, knowing that he lacked sufficient fuel to return to his carrier. It was a decision that epitomized the desperate courage of the Japanese aviators as they faced the collapse of their strategic position. The American task force, meanwhile, was recovering from its own ordeal. The successful dive bombing attack had cost precious aircraft and experienced pilots, and the carriers were frantically trying to land their returning planes, while simultaneously preparing for the inevitable Japanese counterattack. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding from Yorktown, watched his radar screens as the incoming Japanese formation approached from the northwest. The sky above the American fleet erupted in anti-aircraft fire. As the Japanese bombers pushed through the defensive screen, the new American 5-inch proximity-fused shells burst in deadly black flowers around the attacking aircraft, while machine guns from every ship in the task force created a curtain of steel through which the Japanese pilots had to fly. Several bombers were shot down before they could begin their attack runs, their crews disappearing into the Pacific's depths. But Tomonaga's remaining aircraft pressed their attack with the skill and determination that had made Japanese naval aviation feared throughout the Pacific. The Kate bombers, designed for level bombing and torpedo attacks, had been hastily converted to dive bombers for this crucial mission. Despite their pilots' unfamiliarity with dive bombing tactics, they achieved remarkable accuracy against the maneuvering American carrier. 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession, the explosions tearing through her flight deck and penetrating deep into the ship's interior. The carrier's boilers were damaged, reducing her speed to just 6 knots and creating a massive column of black smoke that marked her position for miles around. Damage control parties worked frantically to contain the fires and restore power, while the ship's medical personnel tended to the wounded and dying. As documented in the official Navy history, the Battle of Midway, Yorktown's damage appeared so severe that Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported her as sinking. This intelligence would prove crucial in Hiru's planning for a second strike. Admiral Yamaguchi, believing he had eliminated one American carrier, prepared to launch every remaining aircraft against what he assumed were the 2 surviving enemy flat-tops. The second wave from Hiru consisted of 10 Kate bombers armed with torpedoes and 6 Zero fighters. Lieutenant Hashimoto led this final strike, knowing that his carrier's fate and perhaps Japan's fate in the Pacific depended on the success of this attack. The formation took off at 1:31 in the afternoon, flying through increasingly heavy weather toward the American task force. By this time, however, American damage control had worked another miracle. Yorktown's engineers had restored power to her boilers, and the carrier was making 20 knots and recovering aircraft. When the Japanese torpedo bombers arrived, they found not a crippled hulk, but a fully operational warship defended by a screen of fighters and destroyers. The attack pressed home with typical Japanese courage, but only the torpedoes found their mark. The damage from the torpedo hits was severe enough to force Yorktown's abandonment, but the American carrier remained afloat. More importantly, Hiru had now expended virtually all of her aircraft in the 2 strikes. The last Japanese carrier in the battle had shot her bolt, leaving her defenseless against the inevitable American counterattack that was already being prepared aboard Enterprise and Hornet. As the afternoon sun climbed higher over the Pacific battlefield, the tables had turned completely from the morning's opening moves. The Japanese fleet, which had approached Midway with overwhelming confidence, now found itself scattered and burning. 3 of the 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were either sinking or abandoned, their flight decks twisted wreckage, their hangars gutted by fire and explosion. Admiral Spruance, commanding the American task force from Enterprise, wasted no time in organizing the counterattack against Hiru. The surviving Japanese carrier had revealed her position through her strikes against Yorktown, and American search planes had pinpointed her location approximately 100 miles northwest of the main action. Every available dive bomber and fighter was armed and fueled for what would be the final carrier action of the battle. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led 25 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise toward the last Japanese carrier, while Lieutenant Commander Samuel Adams brought 14 more from Hornet. The combined striking force represented the largest concentration of American naval aircraft launched during the entire battle. As they flew northwest through the afternoon haze, the pilots could see the towering columns of smoke marking the graves of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu far below. Hiru, meanwhile, was preparing for her final stand. Admiral Yamaguchi had ordered every remaining Zero fighter into the air to provide combat air patrol over the carrier. The ship's anti-aircraft guns were manned and ready, while damage control parties stood by to fight the fires that would inevitably result from the coming attack. The carrier's crew, many of whom had served together since the beginning of the war, prepared to defend their ship with the same dedication they had shown in victories across the Pacific. Admiral Nimitz, receiving reports of the victory at his Pearl Harbor headquarters, immediately began planning the next phase of Pacific operations. The initiative had passed to the United States, and he was determined to maintain the momentum. Gained at such terrible cost, the road to Tokyo would be long and bloody, but Midway had proven that Japanese forces could be defeated when faced with superior intelligence, sound tactics, and determined leadership. The political ramifications in Tokyo were equally significant. The Japanese government had promised the nation that decisive victory was within reach, that American will to fight would crumble under the weight of continued defeats. Instead, the loss of 4 fleet carriers demonstrated that the American Pacific Fleet was not only still fighting, but growing stronger. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, lay shattered in the wreckage of the carrier force. As referenced in the definitive account by Gordon Prange, the Battle of Midway marked the beginning of the end for Japanese ambitions in the Pacific. The carrier striking force that had seemed to promise endless victories had been destroyed by the very nation it had sought to defeat. The tide of war, which had flowed so strongly in Japan's favor since December 7, 1941, had turned decisively and permanently. The human cost of the battle would be felt for generations. Thousands of Japanese sailors and aircrew, many of them veterans of multiple Pacific campaigns, had perished in the burning carriers. Their loss represented not just immediate tactical defeat, but the destruction of Japan's most experienced naval aviation personnel. The American losses, while smaller in number, were equally significant in terms of experienced pilots and aircrew who could be spared. From the growing Pacific campaign, the wreckage of the 4 Japanese carriers would rest on the Pacific floor for decades, silent testimony to the day when Japanese naval might crumbled in smoke once Midway's strike. Planes arrived. The battle had lasted less than 24 hours, but its consequences would shape the remainder of World War II and determine the fate of the Pacific. The empire of the rising sun had reached its high water mark and would never again threaten American shores with invasion. In the years that followed, historians would debate the various factors that led to the Japanese defeat: superior American intelligence, tactical mistakes by Japanese commanders, the courage of American pilots, and the devastating effectiveness of dive bombing attacks. But the fundamental truth remained unchanged. At Midway, the Japanese Navy had gambled everything on a single decisive battle and lost. The road to ultimate victory in the Pacific would be long and costly, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The tide had turned, and it would never turn back. The American dive bombers appeared over Hiru at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, their formations silhouetted against the westering sun. The Japanese fighters rose to meet them, but they were too few and too low on fuel to mount an effective defense. The Zeros that had dominated Pacific skies for 6 months were overwhelmed by the sheer number of attacking aircraft and the determination of American pilots, who had seen their comrades die in the morning's torpedo attacks. Gallagher's dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives from 15,000 feet, their engines screaming as they plunged toward the frantically maneuvering carrier below. The first bombs struck Hiru's flight deck at 5:03, punching through the wooden planking and steel underneath to explode in the hangar spaces. Within minutes, the same catastrophic fires that had consumed her sister ships were racing through Hiru's interior spaces. The bombing was devastatingly accurate, for direct hits and several near misses turned the last Japanese carrier into a floating inferno. Her aircraft, caught on the hangar deck during rearming operations, exploded in secondary blasts that shook the ship from stem to stern. Aviation gasoline spread flaming death throughout the vessel, while ammunition detonated in thunderous explosions that could be heard for miles across the Pacific. According to the personal account documented in the first team by John Lundstrom, Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship rather than abandon her to the flames. Standing on Hiru's bridge as the fires closed in around him, he represented the end of an era in naval warfare. The Japanese carrier striking force that had seemed invincible just hours earlier had been reduced to burning wreckage scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean. As darkness fell over the Pacific, the strategic situation had been completely reversed. The Japanese fleet, stripped of its air cover and offensive capability, was retreating westward toward Japan. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the battleship Yamato, faced the bitter reality that his carefully planned operation had resulted in the greatest naval defeat in Japanese history. The dream of decisive victory in the Pacific had died with the carriers in the smoke-filled waters off Midway. The American task force, though reduced to 2 operational carriers after Yorktown's damage, had achieved a victory that would alter the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of experienced pilots, and most critically, the strategic initiative they had held since Pearl Harbor. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned, and it would never turn back in Japan's favor. The night of June 4, 1942, brought an eerie calm to the Pacific waters around Midway. The thunderous roar of aircraft engines and the crash of bombs had given way to the gentle lapping of waves against floating debris, and the occasional hiss of red-hot metal meeting seawater. For Japanese aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were either sunk or sinking, their once mighty forms now reduced to twisted steel and scattered wreckage. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the operation from his flagship Yamato, faced the most difficult decision of his naval career. The combined fleet still possessed overwhelming surface superiority, with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that could pulverize Midway's defenses and potentially engage the American fleet in a night surface action. But without air cover, his ships would be sitting ducks for American land-based aircraft when dawn broke over the Pacific. The human cost of the battle was staggering. Japan had lost over 3,000 naval personnel, including hundreds of irreplaceable carrier pilots who had trained for years before the war. These aviators, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean, could not be quickly replaced. Their loss would cripple Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war, as training new pilots to their level of skill would take years Japan no longer possessed. Captain Clarence McCluskey, the dive bomber leader whose decision to follow the destroyer Arashi had led to the discovery of the Japanese fleet, was pulled from the Pacific waters by an American destroyer after his fuel-starved aircraft ditched during the return flight. His split-second decision to follow the enemy destroyer's wake had changed the course of history. Yet he would spend the night in sick bay, recovering from his ordeal in the ocean. The Japanese destroyer Arashi, ironically, had played a crucial role in her own fleet's destruction. After depth-charging the American submarine Nautilus, she had raced to rejoin the main force, leaving a clear wake that led McCluskey's dive bombers directly to their targets. The submarine attack had been unsuccessful, but it had drawn away Japanese escorts and provided the navigation aid that proved decisive in the battle's outcome. As documented in Mitsuo Fukuda's post-war memoir, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, the Japanese survivors faced a grim reality as they abandoned their burning ships. Many experienced pilots and aircrew members perished not from enemy action, but from the secondary explosions and fires that consumed their carriers. The very aircraft and ordnance that had made the Japanese fleet so formidable became the instruments of its destruction. The American victory had not come without cost. The carrier Yorktown, despite heroic damage control efforts, was listing heavily and would eventually be lost to a Japanese submarine attack while under tow. Nearly 150 American aircrew had been killed during the battle, including the entire crew of Torpedo Squadron 8 except for Ensign George Gay, who had survived being shot down and spent hours floating in the Pacific before being rescued. Admiral Spruance, the quiet former cruiser commander who had led the American carriers to victory, now faced his own difficult decisions. His forces were scattered and low on fuel, while intelligence indicated that powerful Japanese surface forces were still approaching from the west. The temptation to pursue the retreating enemy was strong, but Spruance chose the prudent course of protecting Midway and preserving his remaining carriers for future operations. The strategic implications of the battle were already becoming clear to observers on both sides. Japan had lost the offensive capability that had driven their Pacific expansion since Pearl Harbor. The United States, despite being outnumbered and outgunned at the tactical level, had demonstrated that superior intelligence, better damage control, and determined leadership could overcome seemingly impossible odds. On Midway itself, the defenders emerged from their shelters to survey the damage from the morning's air attacks. The airfield was cratered and buildings were destroyed, but the island remained in American hands. The Marines and Navy personnel who had endured the Japanese bombardment had played their part in the victory, tying down Japanese aircraft and providing the distraction that allowed the American carriers to approach undetected. As the sun set on June 4th, the Pacific War had fundamentally changed. The Japanese Navy, which had seemed invincible just 24 hours earlier, was now retreating toward the home islands with its striking power broken. The American Pacific Fleet, written off as destroyed after Pearl Harbor, had proven that it was not only still in the fight, but capable of decisive victory against the best the enemy could offer. The dawn of June 5, 1942, revealed the full extent of the transformation wrought by the Battle of Midway, where once for mighty Japanese aircraft carriers had cut through the Pacific swells. Now only oil slicks and floating debris marked their passing. The rising sun, symbol of Japanese military might, shone down upon a scene of unprecedented naval devastation that would echo through the remainder of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the strategic mastermind behind Japan's early Pacific victories, stood on the bridge of his flagship Yamato and contemplated the magnitude of the defeat. The combined fleet was retreating toward Japan, its offensive power shattered, its carefully hoarded reserves of experienced pilots scattered across the ocean floor. The decisive victory he had promised the emperor had instead become the turning point that would ultimately doom the Japanese Empire. The American forces, meanwhile, were beginning to comprehend the scale of their achievement. Intelligence reports confirmed that all four Japanese carriers had been sunk or destroyed, along with a heavy cruiser and hundreds of aircraft. The Japanese striking force that had ranged across the Pacific for 6 months, seemingly invincible, had been eliminated in a single day of combat. The psychological impact on both sides would prove as significant as the material losses. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, recovered from his ditching the previous evening, stood on Enterprise's flight deck and watched the last searches return from the battle area. His decision to follow the destroyer's wake had led to the most decisive air attack in naval history, yet he felt the weight of the pilots who had not returned. Victory in the Pacific would require many more such sacrifices before the war's end. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations in the Pacific had been crippled, forcing a shift to defensive strategies that would characterize the remainder of the war. The loss of experienced pilots and aircraft represented a blow from which Japanese naval aviation would never fully recover. Training replacements would take years, time that Japan did not have as American industrial production shifted into high gear.